I'm Carlos Rojas in AIMS, Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and GSF, Gender and Sexuality and Feminist Studies. Professor Guo Junhong, also in AIMS, Asian Studies, and CDS, Center for Documentary Studies. Gareth Price is in Linguistics, and Professor Eileen Chow is also in AIMS and in ADS, Asian American and Diaspora Studies. So maybe we can, just in the interest of democracy, go and begin in alphabetical order. So A, B, C, Chow. Professor Chow, I actually saw a pre-release version of the documentary. I think last year, so it's also appropriate that we begin with her.
So, hi everyone, I'm Eileen. I'm from Taiwan, and I'm also very old friends with Vanessa, and as Carlos had mentioned earlier. And in fact, I have seen several versions of this film, including a near finished draft, which is actually still very different from this year. So I saw, so the Paul Pottinger pieces were, he and I were actually the beta audience for it, and then his interviews that you just heard were edited in actually since, but I heard him say it live, and in fact deeply disagreed with him. But it was really interesting that then she incorporated those segments, into the film as well. So just a couple things, and Carlos already mentioned this. Is it okay if I just speak for a few minutes and then we just... Sylvia Feng, you saw, was one of the executive producers. Actually, when they're having coffee with Tsai Ing-wen, you see her sitting next to Vanessa. And Sylvia Feng was the CEO of Taiwan's public television. And she is also the producer of a film that, if you're a student of mine, you may have seen, because we've actually screened it here at the Ruby, called On Happiness Road, 幸福路上, the animation from Taiwan. And so she is a longtime committed storyteller of Taiwanese stories. And she was introduced to Vanessa, who at that point was making a film about women running for presidencies all around the world. So in fact, it was not at all about Taiwan. It was a film that in fact focused on Hillary Clinton and then also Tsai Ing-wen among her many different subjects. Well, as you know, what happened 8 years ago. So part of, while she was filming, Hillary Clinton did not win the presidency. And but Vanessa realized that something else was exciting and happening in Taiwan as she was filming these sort of women to elected office around the world. And she ended up filming more and more about Taiwan. And as Carlos said earlier, Vanessa is someone who knew Chinese, and she's actually from an old Golden Hollywood era family. Her partner, Double Hope Films, Ted Hope, is a very, very famous independent producer, has won several Oscars. And so she had both the experience, infrastructure, but also actually the interest in China. She worked at the Council of Foreign Relations. She was a master's student in anthropology at Columbia. So she had both a kind of academic background as well as a linguistic background to make the film. And so she decided to entirely pivot to a film about Taiwan. So rather than a film about Tsai Ing-wen, it was a film about Taiwan, as you saw. And also Sylvia Feng then guided her in that pivot to a film about Taiwan. So one of the things that's been really interesting knowing Vanessa, watching her make this film, is seeing her learn about Taiwan as she made the film. So as she started, it was a film about gender. But as you can see, the film that she ended up making is really not about the first woman president of Taiwan, right? It's really about Tsai Ing-wen and the history of Taiwan. And so I think that's really interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and you can see that both in Tsai Ing-wen's candidacy that she presents, but also in the way that Vanessa makes the film, and Vanessa is a very strong feminist, that she really actually downplays that. But that is actually in line with how Tsai Ing-wen sort of historic candidacy was, right? She both kind of played with the whole childless cat lady thing, as you saw the giant poster with her cat. But there was, as she said, there was a lot of stigma to overcome being someone. She has never kind of really introduced a partner, declared her sexuality. We don't know anything about her personal life except for cats, actually, and pets. And so it was really interesting that way, right? That was actually in some ways a more radical gesture than anything else. But she kind of almost willfully made herself this very neutral, almost like a tabula rasa for which people could project, certain kinds of aspirations or also political hopes on. And so I think that's what I think Vanessa captured really well. This really reserved nature of Tsai Ing-wen, and throughout her 8 years of presidency. But I'll stop here. I'm sure everybody, and then we can probably Q&A, right? So.
Great. So D, E, F, G, H. Professor Hong.
Oh, me. Okay. Middle English. Well, I was watching this, I kept thinking this subtitle could be the portrait of a cat lady with no children, right? Yeah, so I think there are two things I would like to just mention because I really would like to hear what you guys have to say. First is that in terms of the idea we think about documentary as a kind of a record or exposition, right? In the sense that it actually has a kind of so I was telling my students, right, so documentary actually is often about the past tense. But of course, I'm wrong with this one, right? So, and also I think very powerfully, we see this urgency of how history actually is changing right in front of our very eyes, right? The war, 2025, it's only just months away. Right, so I was wondering how we then have our own relationship with this kinds of representation, because that's related to my second very brief point. So, is it a representation or is it a presentation? So in some ways, I'm sure a lot of we learn in literature about this unreliable narrator type of thing, right? What if we would encounter is a narrator with great conviction? Right, so I think we cannot avoid this kind of situation where our personal position will be. Right, so to pretend that you have no stance, you have no perspective, you have no side, is an impossible thing. All right, so that also makes this conversation, I think, would be very interesting, at least to me, is to see how then can we still have a conversation with all of us here, maybe coming from very different kinds of backgrounds and very different kinds of affiliations and convictions. So what sort of conversation with this kinds of presentation or representation can bring to us? Yeah. We don't need to count this year.
IJKLMNO.
Here we go. Hi, I'm Gareth Price. You can hear the British accent, and the point I'm getting to here is that kind of the United States is home for now, for me, but Taiwan was home from 2001 to 2007, and it was very. It really did hit me in the feels seeing this kind of on the being represented here. A place I called home and a place I still do call home in part. But that's the sort of kind of the discomforting side of it in some senses. But I think what it does really well is to keep this thread. I mean, it's invisible nation, and the whole thread here is about keeping Taiwan and Taiwan's history and Taiwan, what Taiwan is doing now and has achieved in the past, keeping that visibility in some sort of global panopticon, if you like, and I think that is done so well. I think in terms of what it's trying to achieve, in terms of who it's trying to speak to, I think it does achieve sort of many important things, and it speaks to people who might be unfamiliar with Taiwan just as much as it does speak to people who are familiar with Taiwan, and it sort of gives me sort of hope that these representations do keep these conversations going, do keep these conversations working, and do sort of kind of keep Taiwan visible and keep other sort of issues visible by talking about them, by keeping them front and centre, by keeping them in the conversation. And I think it does that very well to those of us who are sort of insiders, outsiders, and for me somewhere in the middle here.
So I think we're all very curious to hear what the audience thought. If people have comments, questions, critiques, sort of random sort of digressions.
And while we take questions, I was going to say that for those of you who are less familiar with Taiwan, and this goes to Guojing's point, one of the really interesting things watching this film, even a year later, is of course, one of the key characters, Xiao Biting, is now the vice president of Taiwan, right? So, and you see Lai Qingde, the new president of Taiwan, also in one of the final scenes in the temple, that a lot of the players are ongoing players. And so that's kind of interesting to see this, what this, plus there are a lot of friends in the film, but to see how it gets, you see almost like precisely that kind of generational handover that the story is about.
Thanks. I'm speaking on behalf of an international student from mainland China. And I have a lot of feelings after watching this film because it challenges a lot of previous settings or official narratives that I have been taught for like 18 plus years. But I'm still wondering some of the improvements of this film, one of which is that if we draw a very classic four-dimensional matrix, on one side is China and Taiwan, on the other dimension is official narrative and public idea. So we've seen the public idea and also the official tone from Taiwan. And also we've seen clips of official tones from China, which is the talks from Xi Jinping. But we are missing a key piece of the public opinion from mainland China, I think, in this video. And I understand how difficult it is in these days to get real public opinion from mainland China to see how the people in that place, their real feelings about this island, about the unification of their nation. But I think there are still like some ways we can try to at least get a piece of their idea to better understand how they view the situation. Because eventually, when we talk about the potential risk or even the coming war, it is not like the dictator himself going to fight the war. It is hundreds, millions of ordinary people, their kids, like their husbands, going to the war zone against other hundreds of millions of civilians and ordinary people. So I think a key consideration here is that I would be really happy to know more about, if there is actually a systematic or more trustworthy way to get the idea of general public, ordinary people from the mainland side, which I think has always been a missing picture in all of these documentaries or international coverages. Like it has been missing for a long time. And I think getting a bit of it, getting a brief idea of it is very important. Thanks.
If I could,
Should we take a few?
sure. But maybe let's follow up. I mean, you introduce yourself as representing students from China. What would you?
I'm sorry, what?
How would you answer your own question?
Answer my own questions. Yeah, I was actually expecting your answer. So
No, you're asking about popular opinion from China. You're saying that that's missing from the film.
correct. Because, like judging from what I saw, also I talked to a lot of people from my campus in China, also not other people in society, ordinary workers, and I mean, if you're just an ordinary people in society doing your own job, living your own life, I think the last thing you want to do is having a war that would totally destroy your normal life, right? And I mean that if you have normal mental stability, you'll think that war is a terrible thing. And I think that the key point for these people is that there is a huge discourse between their daily life, the peace they're trying to maintain, and the grand narrative they've been taught, the propaganda they face. Like they've been taught for decades that we're going to liberate Taiwan, we're going to send them peace or unification or whatever. But to be honest, that has totally nothing to do with their ordinary life. But somehow they managed to cope these two. They managed to accept it. And if you're an outsider, if you're a foreign person, you will be shocked about how Chinese people could, if you don't talk about politics, if you don't mention Taiwan at all, they're peaceful, they're friendly. But as long as you mention this critical issue, you say, oh, Taiwan, if as long as you mention, oh, I think Taiwan is an independent country, don't be like, what are you talking about? I need to stay away from you. Like, so there's a great separation about this normal life and propaganda, the great narrative, and I think that it's very important to understand how these two coexist on ordinary public in China.
Great, thank you.
Could I quickly respond? I think also Guojing wanted to say something too. Thank you for that comment. Really, really much appreciated. But I will, and I appreciate your frankness too. But I do want to quickly say that part of what Vanessa didn't want to do is to center China, right? So this is a story about Taiwan, right? I totally see what you're saying, and that it is really important to hear what people, because if war comes, then it's about ordinary people fighting war, right? And we want to know more about Russians, not Putin, right? But on the other hand, this film, I think, is really about making Taiwan's story legible. And so Taiwan doesn't only exist in a US-China-Taiwan triangle. And this is why I said earlier, I didn't love that she added the Matt Pottinger pieces, because Matt Pottinger, of course, was a foreign advisor on China under Trump and is a famous war hawk, right? And so his whole presentation was about how China sees Taiwan as another block, domino, and in this sort of East Asia strategy. And I remember telling Vanessa, I think this is a mistake because I feel like then you really are centering China, right? You're talking about China strategy, but also what a US war hawk would say about China strategy. And what I really wanted to hear more, and I felt, probably you all felt, and I love to hear that some of the most touching parts, and maybe what gave Gareth the feels, are scenes of Taiwan, right? Scenes of people, scenes of temples, scenes of people cheering on their democracy. And so I hear what you're saying, but I think that's a different film. I feel like this film is about Taiwan.
Oh, thank you, Eileen. I think you said it a lot more eloquently than I wanted to say. Basically, I think there's one thing to actually to be open to things like this is not to ask what it doesn't do, it's to actually pay attention to what it actually does, right? So in the sense that, so that brings us to the other, I think, very important question that you asked. So why don't we get a lot of access to the opinion or feeling of the ordinary people, as you call it, in China? Why, right? So I actually do not believe that we don't have access to them, but the access are very, very much restricted. That's the point. I work with a lot of, now they call independent filmmakers. They used to be underground, illegal, whatever filmmakers. So there are a lot of people who are working very, very hard to try to bring certain kinds of understanding or partial truth to the world, but that access is precisely the kind of systemic differences we're talking about between Taiwan and China. So I don't want to revert back to that kind of binary to discredit a different kind of binary. But I think that is the kind of reality where I want to also mention this is that it is a very political stance, right? In order for Taiwan to become Taiwan, that Taiwan talk about Taiwan on its own term, this is a very, very important strategic move. It's a very, very important action. Part of the thing I worked on was Taiwan film history, right? So I actually wanted to bring out this idea of what I call the historiography of absence. So it's why didn't Taiwan cinema exist, say, before New Taiwan cinema? Of course it existed. It's a particular kind of historiography that rendered it invisible. And that is precisely what this film is doing, is to counter that and not to be neutral. I think neutrality, objectivity can be a hindrance for moving forward, actually.
Okay, so let's collect. Gareth, did you want to? Yeah. Let's collect a few comments and questions, and then.
Timothy, I'm a senior. I am a political science student, and I'm very interested in both Taiwan and the surrounding region of Southeast Asia. So I think I get that this is a movie about Taiwan, and I really appreciated that, especially as somebody who studied abroad there. And it was great when I was there to see it beyond what I saw it in my classrooms as lines on a map, very Pottinger-esque version of seeing things. But I feel like at the end of the day, it's very difficult to separate Taiwan and its people from the greater geopolitical forces at play. The US is the main security guarantor of Taiwanese sovereignty. Taiwan can only do so much by itself, and the US maintains strategic ambiguity. One thing that I actually didn't really like about one thing that I felt that this movie mischaracterized was the Biden comment. Biden did say that the US would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. What they didn't mention was that the State Department 3 different times after that walked him back on those comments. So Pottinger's a war hawk. I get that, and I understand why they included him in this movie, because it's hard to talk about Taiwan without talking about its status and the consequences of its actions. If we didn't have to worry about its whole role in like the U.S.-China relationship, then we could just have Taiwanese independence and call it a day. But the U.S., at least on the U.S. side, it's always been the U.S.'s policy that any unilateral change to the status quo on the Strait, both a Chinese invasion and Taiwanese independence, is something that the U.S. opposes. So I guess moving like on the same theme of separating the government from its people. Clearly, I mean, I'm an American, I'm wearing a Taiwan pin right now, I'm clearly already on board with this. What can Americans who are sympathetic to the cause do to help Taiwan? Because I know that Americans, well-meaning and not well-meaning, have been unhelpful and helpful in the past. So I'm very curious what someone who wants to go into foreign policy and public policy like myself, what I can do to help this type of situation.
These are great questions.
Yeah, I
Lucy?
think a couple people.
Would-
No, I think a couple people were. I think it's great.
Given that you suggested this, do you have anything you want to say?
Oh boy, I'm being put on the spot. I have many things I could say. Honestly. Okay, sorry, Eileen, I'm going to disappoint you a little bit. You wanted to come here and not talk about the election. And I am curious about how the outcome of tomorrow, given that it's so top of mind and that we are on the eve of the election, how the outcome of tomorrow will affect U.S.-Taiwan relations and the future of all of this.
Okay.
There were a couple hands in the middle.
Pass the microphone over.
Hi, I'm a graduate student here at Duke. I'm also from mainland China, but I have been following Taiwan for a long time. One thing that I want to talk about, or like just as a question about, which is also my personal struggle, is about this moralized discourse about democracy that are depicted in the movie, in the documentary, where I feel like there was this construct of a naturalized linkage between democracy and peace. Whereas, authoritarianism are portrayed as sort of like a natural warmonger. I think for me, at this specific moment, I look back, I find it a bit ironic, but I understand why, such a sort of like demarcation should be, are to be made in this film to really speak for Taiwan's case. And I do sympathize with Taiwan's, either the state or the people's sentiment about feeling threatened by China, and and to really gauge every support that it can from people who are sympathetic, or like nations who are sympathetic, which are sympathetic to Taiwan's course. But for me, it's that which is also in my own research, I trying to uncover improve visibility, or uncover voices from marginalized groups, just as Taiwan, the invisible nation, how to make it being visible, but at the same time trying to not to fall into some sort of imperial discourse or something. So I wonder how do we make a balance to that in our own effort of asking for Taiwan's case or supporting Taiwan's case, which I think it might be in a way strengthening the case for Taiwan to some extent. Yeah, that's my question and comment.
Other hands?
Thank you. I just wanna quick reply for the representative of Chinese international student that Mister? Yeah. So like in the first image, for me, like why they don't include. I mean, your opinion is super interesting. I appreciate that. But like for me, the first thought I think why the director didn't include Chinese common people's opinions is about because do no harm. It's ethical issue. Like if the director include the Chinese common people's opinions, that person might be, I don't know. Like I was concerned about that. So that's what I thought because I'm a PhD student, IRB, all those things before we conduct our fieldwork research, blah, blah, blah. So that's my first image. So I don't know, that's my personal guess. And the other, my little comments about these films, like I was wondering why why the director only focus on the Buddhist religious rituals. I mean, Taiwan has like Catholic, Christian, and also Taoism, everything, like anything. So like all different kinds of religion. I don't know if it's probably because of the limitation of the time when she stayed there, only these two biggest rituals happen there. And also the last one is like, because I noticed like some very important Japanese prime minister like Kishida-san was in the film. I was wondering like how, it's also important like, what's the term? Ex-prime minister Abe said that Taiwan emergency, Japan emergency. So I don't know, that's also, if we can include that, which can make things more complicated and interesting, but I also understand it's about Taiwan, like this movie is about Taiwan. So yeah, that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do any of our panelists want to respond to?
A very quick one. Like Mr. B, I guess. I think you actually mentioned something very, very important in terms of the political discourse and rhetoric. So the idea of like the kind of you say is a naturalized linkage between democracy and freedom. I would actually say that is actually in contention to the kind of political rhetoric that has been propagated in China. What? Harmony. Right? So I remember hearing a lot of students during the sunflower or the umbrella movements, a lot of students from China who were very, very smart, very critical, very sympathetic to the course, but eventually they resorted to this sentiment and say, well, but if that caused, disruptions, violence, and something, is it worth it? Isn't it better that we all live harmoniously? So I think that in this context, that is the imperializing rhetoric, not the other way around. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe not so.
Okay, yeah, Lucy, really. I know. I mean, just in class earlier, I was saying this is our escape. No. Well, I have lots of thoughts on that, but a couple different things. Connect's point about democracy. Mm-hmm. This film is very ironic to watch, even from a year plus ago when I watched this in its final draft to now, because of course, one thing is Taiwan is very, very pro-Israel, as a state. Because it is pro-America, right? Mm-hmm. So it very much formally, sort of stands with the U.S. and Biden administration's attitude towards Israel. And you would think the best analogy of Taiwan might be Palestine, right? But but you can see why politically it would be very, very complex for Taiwan as a state to say anything that was not kind of in line with the U.S. administration. So that's a very kind of interesting. I mean, of course, there are a lot of sort of grassroots protests that have happened because Taiwan is that kind of place, and it's great. But I think that Tsai Ing-wen and Lai Ching-te's official stance is that. Another thing is I've always thought of Taiwan as a messy democracy, which is your point. But how can we not see this through the lens of U.S. politics when the Sunflower Movement, which I supported and also had so many friends who were part of, but how do you not see those scenes and not think January 6th on some level, right? So it is very, very hard to get out of a particular kind of lens of a particular kind of historical moment that we're always in this kind of bifurcated, that we see it from our stands, but we also see the lacuna, we see the silences, we see the stories that are not taught. One of the things that really occurred to me this time watching is there's no mention of Chen Shui-bian, right? In this kind of democratization of Taiwan, you don't talk about 2000 to 2008, like altogether, the first DPP president of Taiwan, because he's just he ended up in jail. So, but it's like who vanished, right? Like his whole legacy, his whole story. He was a democracy activist. He was also jailed. He was the first person to take advantage of what Li Denghui opened up in a democratization process. He was the first other party to win, but no Chen Shui-bian in this narrative. So that kind of silence is, of course, a choice. And sometimes I feel like this is what, but maybe this film is also trying to do a little too much, right? There's too many things going on. I totally appreciate the IRB comment, by the way. I think that's amazing and important, and is about documentary ethics, something of what you were saying, working with independent filmmakers, like something that, constantly is a subject of discussion. But I do think you're right, that this is a question of ethics and access. And the religion thing, I think, is a question of access, right? Because she's based in the US. So she flew back repeatedly but you can see a lot of them were New Year's right? So she was also hitting certain times of year. So instead of Mazu or, she's not hitting necessarily other kinds of secular moments or religious moments in Taiwan. And Timothy, that was a great comment, and a lot more than, being a policy person. But I think, and this kind of relates to Lucy's question, right? Trump last week just said Taiwan is a mafia. It's like a mob boss because they own all the silicon chips and semiconductor chips. And he basically was implying that, Taiwan should pay us to protect them and we should get, some control of the chips, right? But of course, Trump says everything, so who knows? But that was a scary moment for those of us who care about Taiwan to hear that, because we don't know what's going to happen after tomorrow, and that was a real gesture. We also happen to know, if Trump does win, that he is very enamored by strong men. He always talks about how much he likes Xi Jinping, and precisely that Xi Jinping, because he can control 1.3 billion people, under his thumb, right? This is a direct quote from Trump, right? But the Democrats also have a very, very complicated and spotty record, in terms of their support of Taiwan. So, who knows what's to come, but maybe it's a question of lesser harm, is how I'm thinking of it. But.
Thank you. So IRB and Trump together. It's fallen to me. So people who I do have an IRB to work with are the foreign communities in Taiwan. And to go to Timothy's question, what can sort of Americans kind of do to further these conversations and increase this visibility? I'm going to go for it's a really complicated question to answer, because my work with foreign communities in Taiwan, when I was there 20 years ago, in general, people in the foreign communities were pro-independent, very pro-democratic, and you sort of knew where kind of people stood politically as a sort of group, not a homogenous group by any stretch of the imagination. What I've noticed, less in terms of people actually saying this to my face in interviews, but certainly in the discourses that you get in Facebook groups, on the expat pages and things like that, where the real stuff comes out, is that you can get these discourses where people are very pro-Taiwan and also at the same time very pro-Trump and very right-wing in terms of kind of being big. So it's really complex. It feels almost like a jarring sort of kind of two frames that are jarring together. But people will say, well, but China is communist and we are capitalist. We support Trump and we support Taiwanese independence. And so they can hold all these different sort of kind of weird sort of kind of weirdly jarring positions at once. My point to get to sort of answering the question there is to say, what kind of discourses are coming out from the foreign communities to people back home? Because those are conversations are, at kind of, virtual Thanksgivings, or, when people go home, come back to the States, for example, or UK, for example, to have those conversations and things like that. These films need watching at Thanksgiving. I would say that would be my first. It would be like a mass screening kind of for Thanksgiving. But there's going to be very complicated discourses coming out and coming through the foreign communities who live there to people back home, and perhaps those are a very primary way people get news about Taiwan is through people who actually live there. So from my research, it's a difficult question. I don't have an easy answer to that.
If I could just, I had a question for you all actually, but one of the things that, and you're my students, sorry Lucy, that if you hear a lot from me is, that in kind of journalism 101 in Taiwan, you always ask, 谁支持谁反对谁得利谁受损, right? That who supports a narrative, who is opposed to a narrative, who profits from a narrative, and who is actually left out of a narrative. And I'd be really curious about folks who are from Taiwan in the audience, who do know Taiwan well. What do you feel about that? What's left out? What's very highlighted? What did you feel? We've heard from a few Chinese students also about what they saw and didn't see. But I'm really curious, like, 同胞们, what did you think? What did you think was left out? What do you think was highlighted? What did you like? What did you dislike?
Good question.
Oh, hello. Thank you for the shout out. Sorry for my voice. So, I was very happy to know that we have a lot of students from mainland China joining us. And as a student from Taiwan, it's a very hard feeling to see so many people show up just to watch this film tonight. For me personally, I think there was kind of a lacking perspective from countries around, just like Japan or even from Europe. It's very limited to China, Taiwan, and U.S. And even from this structure, you can barely see if the rationale of the U.S. policy were factored into this film. Like, for example, why is Taiwan struggling in this invisible position, and how, just as another student from poli-sci mentioned, that the strategic ambiguity has been maintained from the 1960s, 70s until now, and but I do appreciate that she made this effort, and at least we have something to present to the world. But I would say a lot of things were kind of shined toward a brighter and more neutral side. I'd say just for even in context of introducing the Sunflower movement, we kind of lacked the political background at that time, and the presidential support was really low. And we got the brighter side of President Ma, but we didn't see his other side in this film being represented. But yeah, I would say that's just
Thank you.
the things on top of my mind.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? There's behind you.
Oh, hi. We are interpoled by Professor Zhou, so I think I should speak. I'm Eileen. I'm a media school student at Indiana University, actually. But just things about the film that left out. I think one thing is indigenous right, especially Banai and her relationship with Tsai Ing-wen, and how the Thai government kind of disappointed her. And there's and she and her group of people kind of occupying a small place in, what's the park called now? The 228 park, and I think they occupied there. They have a tent there for a while. So that's one thing I think that's kind of missing. And another thing is transitional justice. I think Tsai's position is much more conservative in the sense that she doesn't want to push things too radically or too firmly. So the whole transitional justice program now in Taiwan kind of became this historical research archival project, which is very important, but it's also not enough. So that's kind of the two things that came top of my mind. Thank you.
Voices. I'm a grad student from UNC. One thing I see missing is that there's this recent growth in supporting the politician Ko Wen-je, and also younger teens' voices on how they view the political conflict between the KMT and DPP. That's something I feel it's missing, but it's a very growing voice in Taiwan. Another thing I think is kind of missing
it might be a intention from the director, is that on food security and policy trade in Taiwan. I remember there was this trade made on pineapples and like rice, selling to like Singapore or like other neighboring countries in Taiwan. We saw it as a win. I think it was in 2019 or 20. We saw it as a win, but then because there's the economic sanctions, so other countries were hesitant to follow that lead, and so a win doesn't count as a win, and we kind of try to keep it invisible, so we don't suffer the same kind of sanctions again, but we can still maintain the trade. That delicacy, I feel, could be, I don't know if it's better to amplify more or not to amplify it. Those are the two main things that I wanted to share.
Thank you.
Can I quickly add on? Oh, sorry. Then I will pass the microphone you for 30 seconds later. So yeah, I because it's about the invisible nation, and since we should put the Taiwan in the center, and then, but I'm curious, like how other people see this invisible nation. If like the director can give us some interviews about like American students, because when I was a TA, I always introduce myself. Hi, everybody. I'm your TA. I'm Shay. I'm from Taiwan. Do you know where Taiwan is? And I show up the world map. And I mean, right now, almost every student, like after 2020, they know where Taiwan is. But like 5 years ago or 6 years ago, people just like, somewhere next to China. Yeah, like that. So I was, or Thailand. Yeah, they would think like I'm from Thailand or something. So I think that's since you asked like what she can add on, I think like quick reviews about how different countries see Taiwan, invisible or visible. That would be more interesting. Thank you. Sorry, 30 seconds.
Passing it down.
It's a long journey for my
Long journey though. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a UNC graduate student, and I'm so appreciate that you present this documentary film for as someone who studied the relationship between state and certain industry sectors. I have one comment on what I feel is not that presented in this film is one of our UNC fellow mentioned the burgeoning part of the young generation that kind of trying to stay away from the two political parties, but also there's still like 20 or 30% of Taiwanese people still vote for KMT, still vote for the pro-China party, and they are kind of invisible in this documentary film. I feel this is a bit tricky because this film presents like every Taiwanese has a very similar concern that we want to render our visibility across the globe, but somehow it is probably not that homogeneity. And also I have a question for maybe everyone here, is that this documentary film also presents Taiwan's effort on rendering invisibility across the globe. But as we now notice that entering 2020s, all such efforts will be seen like a challenge against China's one China principle. So yeah, my question is, in such political tension and condition, what kind of move, or I don't know, can we make while not keep kind of instigating this tension or potential conflicts in very near future? Thank you.
Where are you from?
I'm from Taiwan.
Anyone else?
Somebody.
Hi, I'm Gloria. I'm a neurosurgery PA here at Duke, and I am Taiwanese American. I was born in America, and I have the narrative of being raised by Taiwanese parents who were very pro-Taiwan. And I think there's a little bit of, I think as this gentleman mentioned, there is certainly Taiwanese independence, and there is Taiwan, and then there is, okay, we have some relationships and some roots that, we have friends and we have relationships with mainland China too. And I think those are complicated things. I think this film is for an hour and 25 minutes, it's a very, this is a complicated topic, and there's a lot that's kind of in here, and I really applaud her efforts to kind of bring this as one effort to kind of bring Taiwan to the forefront. My experience as a Taiwanese American, and like I said, my dad is very pro-Taiwan, and I would say he's probably very pro-Taiwanese independence, but he was in the military, which, as some of you, probably many of you know, is required. He endured both Japanese and Chinese occupations, and so there's a perspective there that you just don't let go of very easily. And to the policy questions, I think that, and as you mentioned with certain politicians and their flippant remarks, I think you have to be very careful about how you phrase things and how you state, inter-country relationships or inter-economic dependencies and all of those kinds of things, because if you're very flippant about your remarks, I don't think you're helping anybody. I think that's inflammatory. And I don't think inflammatory things help people to come together to see common ground. I think it just it's a you versus, it's us versus them kind of mentality, and I just don't think that helps.
It seems to me that one of the issues that is in the background of all these comments and questions is audience, right? If this were a documentary directed to an audience of Taiwan specialists, or even directed primarily to an audience of people from Taiwan, it would be a very different film. But I think that it is intended for the international film circuit, for people who can't necessarily identify Taiwan on a map, right? I think that in terms of global conflicts, in this day and age, people are much more familiar with the issues of, say, Ukraine and Russia, or Israel and Palestine, and Taiwan is, for people in this audience, is probably very familiar, but internationally, I think it's a less known quantity. And I think there's a version of this film, it would have been very ambitious, but there's a version of this film that could have used a complex illustration of these internal contestations within Taiwan, right? Of how complicated Taiwan politics is, and how many different voices there are within the space of sort of this Taiwan socio-political unity, including the global Taiwan diaspora, to illustrate the force and the vibrancy of Taiwan's democracy, right? And Taiwan's democratic society. But that would have been a very, very sort of, I think, difficult line to walk, right? Because to do that in an affirmative way for people that don't really know Taiwan, versus to do that and make Taiwan just look messy and contested and sort of people arguing with one another. So, and what I think that the main message that the documentary is trying to convey, and it does present all different voices, right? There's not a unified voice that it's presenting. And it's interesting that the director never speaks, right? We never hear her. When we hear her channeled via Professor Chow.
Well, we hear her in a few interviews.
Okay, yeah. So, but we don't. But I think it's trying to sort of make the point that Taiwan is essentially autonomous. It's been autonomous, functioning nation state since '49, and that's something that seems obvious to people in this room, I think, or maybe not, but to many people. But it's not, I think, that obvious internationally. So.
I think Carlos really has a great point about it. It's really who the audience, who is this film made for, right? What is it introducing? Speaking of doctoral students, I had a doctoral student from a former institution come give a job talk here at Duke, and she works on Taiwan, and then she's still suddenly in the middle. It's a very technical job talk in music, but she suddenly had to do like this 10-minute break where she was introducing Taiwan is located here on the map, and this whole little break in the middle, and this was, I guess, 2016 or so. But and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, she's speaking in a specialized field on a very specialized topic, and she still has to have her little Taiwan is located here and Taiwan used to be a Dutch colony moment, right? So as if every time you tell a story, you have to begin there. And goes back to what the Vietnamese American writer Viet Nguyen has said, right? It's narrative scarcity versus narrative plenitude. So if you're the one film, Invisible Nation, then you have to tell it all, and she crams a lot of stuff in there. But if there's narrative plenitude and there are 10 films about Taiwan, then you don't have to do it all, right? You can focus on indigenous rights. You could focus on internal dissent, and so that is maybe the anxiety of narrative scarcity.
I always try to convey to my students, MFA students especially, right? I think documentary should have at least two lives. The first life is how you, as the filmmaker, work it out as a certain kinds of body of something. But it should have a second life, or even third, fourth life. It takes place in a situation like this. I have another point now. I forgot. Yeah, but I said, oh yes, I was in the army for 2 years. So if you are interested, I can tell you a lot about it. Yeah.
So it's 9:30 at the beginning of a week. So
It's end of the world.
well, I was going to say some of us can go back to doom scrolling. But thank you so much for coming out, and thank you so much for your comments and questions and discussion. So, okay. Thank you for our panelists.
Please go vote if you are able tomorrow. So I'll be at the Durham bus station all day. If anybody wants to join us.